All right, hello and welcome everybody. We are starting here with the Binge the Bible breakdown. I'm Pastor Nathan, pastor here at Elk River Lutheran.
And Jeremy Hallquist, the intern pastor.
Yeah, and so we are starting this new Binge the Bible sermon series. That was this graphic that was on during the introduction where it's kind of a play off the Netflix thing, you know, where you Netflix and chill, maybe binge some TV shows. And what we're going to be doing for the next 6 weeks is binging the Bible, meaning in 6 weeks, we're going to walk through the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. That's a lot of Bible. It's a big book, but we're going to do that. And so obviously we're not going to hit everything that's in this big, beautiful, complex book. But we're going to try to hit as much as we can. And during this time, on Thursdays, we're going to do a little more in-depth thing. Each week on Sundays, we'll have a introduction to the section of the Bible that we're talking about for that week. And we'll have a sermon that plays on the themes and what that section of the Bible might have to say for our everyday lives. And then, like I said, midweek then, we're going to go a little more in-depth. And so that's what you're here for today, a little more in-depth Bible breakdown. So, so that's kind of where we're at with the Bible. So if you have a Bible handy, great. If you're on a device, you can maybe look online and find an online Bible. If not, that's no problem either. So, yeah. Well, so Jeremy has taught a class called Genesis to Revelation. And so that was a how many week class?
It turned out to be most of a year with a pandemic in the middle. So
yeah.
There are some people that have
something
kind of
probably like 30 classes that were like an hour long or
hour and a half. Yep.
And so we're going to squish that into 6 30 to 45 minute sessions here on Thursdays, right?
Right. We may be biting off more than we can chew, but it'll be fun to do. Yeah.
So what were you kind of thinking with the Bible, and what's got you excited about Genesis to Revelation?
Yeah, I think for me it's I grew up in a Lutheran most of my life, and so kind of had this lectionary style approach to ministry,
right?
And to reading scripture, and that was. Well, this week we're going to talk about this chunk of maybe the Noah story, and then next week we're going to jump to the woman at the well, and we've moved around in Scripture, and so my understanding and wrestling with Scripture really kind of came out of this sense of like, if this is the whole book of God and the people of God, shouldn't there be some sort of continuity in the story and some sort of making sense? And I think because of the way I had always experienced it, you catch this piece, but you miss the pieces before and after. And so I really kind of got into diving a lot deeper and thinking about how do we thread the needle from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation, and how do those stories fit together as one continuous narrative? And now there are some things where history plays in, and there's some confusion in how the canon is organized.
Yeah.
But for the most part, as we think about Scripture, it really has a similar story. And most of those things come in God's faithfulness and the faithlessness of God's people.
Yeah.
Right? And so we screw it up. God says, well, wait a minute. There's still more to this story. And continuing to see that even as we've moved beyond what we've called the everyday written scripture to the living, breathing Bible that we experience in life today.
Yeah.
You know, where God still shows up.
Sure.
And so thinking about how does that all kind of thread and weave together, and how do we wrestle with this big, complex, messy, beautiful book?
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And so maybe one place to start would be, so this first week we're studying the first 5 books of the Bible, right? And so they're called the Pentateuch. We'll get there. I wonder if it wouldn't be worth just holding up a Bible and saying, this is the Bible, right? And so the Bible is divided up into different books, and then those books get divided up into 2 parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's kind of like, BC and AD, where you have Jesus kind of right in the middle. The Gospels in the New Testament start off telling the life of Jesus and the church after, and the Old Testament is everything that happened before. And so we're starting the Old Testament, and any Bible you have is going to be divided up in that way. And when we were talking about Genesis to Revelation, what I appreciate about the Bible is almost every Bible that I've ever had has some kind of description of the book of the Bible at the beginning of that book. And some Bibles, like I have the Lutheran Study Bible here. I know we both have HarperCollins Study Bibles too. Mm-hmm. They go into even more depth and stuff. So there's Bibles, the actual Bibles themselves can be pretty good resources, and a lot of the information we're sharing here today could be found in a Bible, certainly in a study Bible.
Right. And I think it's important to note too, like we talk about Scripture as the written text that we have in front of us. It's important to note, like as we're thinking about these stories and the things that are coming up, it'll come up in Genesis as we think about Genesis 1.
Yeah.
These are not written at the time it happened. God didn't say, oh, on day 1 we're going to do this, and then let it be so. But it's a story that's passed on orally, so people hear that story. And that's how the story kind of carries this imagery and this beauty.
Right.
Because the best way to tell a story is make it relatable.
Right.
And so thinking about that as an important kind of factor as we're talking about, well, did Jonah get really swallowed by a whale? There's some questions there, right?
Yeah.
But it also gives us permission to say, hey, wait a minute, there might be some places that feel a little confusing, but if you think about the bigger picture, this bigger story, how does that really kind of play into conversation?
I think that's really, I like that idea that the Bible isn't the Star Tribune, right? It wasn't written like a newspaper. It's not like a TV broadcast covering live breaking news. It's more like your family stories, right? like my great grandparents who came over from Norway and the ship, and we have these family stories, and they're really good and true stories, but over the years the facts kind of get, some facts get lost, others maybe get created, and the truth is that's probably the case with the Bible too, and we'll see some of that even as we get into Genesis. So
right, I think that's a great place for us to kind of dive right in as you're kind of going. If you're online and joining us and you have a question or you're thinking about this, even if it's after the fact, like the live recording, tell us those questions, because I think that's something we want to be able to answer and wrestle with and think about. And I love questions, so that's some of my fun too.
Yeah, so we'll be kind of monitoring. We got our laptops here if you're dropping questions in the feed or just saying hello. We'd love that, and by all means do that. So
right, and I think like Genesis is a great place to start, and any good story has to start with a good foundation.
Yep.
So thinking about like the opening credits to any movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my favorite way to think about this beginning text is the world is dark. The screen's just getting fired up, and here we go, kind of boom, right into this this spoken moment, and life goes from nothingness to all of these created days. Thinking about these early Genesis texts, like think about that open credits to a movie, and then how does the story then play out there? God speaks and creation begins to exist. So word becomes important right from the very beginning. And then we see these 6 days of creation with a day of rest. And all this kind of mystery and wonder that comes in and out of all of that too.
It's good. Yeah, so that's the Pentateuch is these first 5 books of the Bible. And so like my Bible here divides about Genesis to Deuteronomy, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Traditionally those books were often attributed to Moses, saying that Moses wrote them. In reality, he probably didn't write them all. He probably shared them some. I don't know what Moses' role is. He's the main character in one of the books, I know that. But that's the Pentateuch, these first 5. So do we want to dive into Genesis?
So I think that's a good way for us to kind of get the conversation rolling. But,
sounds good.
But I think it's that couple things that I would point out is one, that word becomes super important, but also then what is the purpose, right? I think it's the question that everybody asks, what's the meaning of life? Those sort of big philosophical things. I think it's important to note that God creates things in relationship. So sun and darkness, water and dry land, like each has a point and a counterpoint. But even as we move a little bit further into it, we get human and God, or human and created animals. And thinking about this sense of that God's at work in all of this is relational. And so thinking about how does that really begin to tell what the rest of the narrative of Scripture is. God sees man and says, oh, that's not good for man to be alone. And then immediately creates animals for the man to name. In Genesis 1, Genesis 2, it becomes God creates woman out of man. One kind of cool thing that happens, this is the Bible nerd in me, but Adam, this idea in Adam, the Hebrew word for dirt is I'm going to do this wrong probably, Adam and Adamah, One is the name of Adam, and one is the name of dirt. They've sound so similar. They're actually root words in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And so the relationship between man and created being becomes incredibly important.
Right.
And so thinking about this, like dust and dust man, kind of how it goes.
Yeah.
But then later plays into Ish is the name for man, Isha is the name for woman. That they're created as similar, identical, caring beings.
Sure.
And so think about that idea of relationship as we move like through these narratives and into the story, because everything that follows really this kind of opening scene of Genesis is how we as humans really do our best to screw that completely up.
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah, that is it. Yeah, and so when you start right at the beginning of Genesis, of course, starts with the creation story. That's going to be our biblical text for this coming week. We'll have the creation story read at worship. And if you've read the Bible and looked at Genesis before, the creation story comes in chapter 1, and then you turn the page and you get to chapter 2, and it's another account of creation. And I think that just gets at what Jeremy was saying earlier about, what you were saying about that these stories were told orally for years and years and years, and it's later that they get all collected into one, written down, and put into one place. And so at the time when they did that, they had to kind of sort through, okay, well, we've got these multiple stories of creation. Which ones should we use? They maybe had 3 or 4 of them, and they're like, well, we'll put these 2 in there. Like,
right.
We can't just put them both in, and so I think that's a beautiful part of the Bible, that it's not like even the people who wrote the Bible and put it together weren't so stuck on this is exactly how it happened. This is not how it happened, so throw it away. They were like, these stories both speak to who God is and who we are as people. Put them both in. Like that's not contradictory or problematic. That's actually life-giving, because we all experience God and life in different ways. Even the same experiences, we experience them differently. So It makes sense.
Right, and to think about how do those stories begin to tell different perspectives and different human experience. The people struggle with this question of, well, what does the God say? When is it day one? God created this. Is that one day as we know it? All of those big scientific questions, and the real conversation, I think, comes down to what is God's intent. It's not necessarily the literalism that we hope for, but really to say, what is God wanting us to be aware of? And even so much so, like day 7, this day of creation, connects us as human beings to God's work.
Yeah.
And thinking about that, our space in this story, I think that becomes incredibly powerful to think about.
Yeah, right. Because that's, if you get so caught up on what day are we on? It's not till the 4th day that you get day and night. And so the notion of a 24-hour day doesn't exist till day 4. So if you're really getting hung up on those details, you're missing the overall point, like you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, as we move into the story beyond creation, the tree, this idea of knowledge and wisdom, all of those conversations really start to say, where does that relationship take a different turn? And I think that's one of those, I'm going to jump just a hair forward.
Yeah.
But even the story of Cain and Abel, right?
Yeah.
Is the first death recorded in Scripture is a homicide. So think about how that carries us into this narrative. It's as much about God's people trying to be on equal footing with God and going, well, that doesn't quite work. And then we have this idea of they're thrown out of the garden, Cain and Abel happens, and the first thing is a homicide.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the story, as it happens, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
This unfolding of, we break that promise, that covenant that God has to put us on equal space with creation, and to be workers and partners in creation, to the point that now we destroy creation as an act of kind of a rebellion, I think. Right. And so all of those next stories really tell that narrative over and over again.
They do. And that's that kind of process that repeats itself.
Right. And you'll see it again, the Noah story is another great example of God is angry that humanity has done all of these things to destroy creation and ruin relationship with one another, and says, well, I'm going to send a flood.
Mm-hmm.
But then that promise thing hangs in there, and God says, well, it's as important that I'm going to destroy creation, but we're going to keep some animals and one really good family that does some good things. And so there's this kind of back and forth in this story of God wanting this sort of ending because that would be easier, but God's love and faithfulness to the promise plays way beyond that.
Yeah, I think the Bible really plays with and wrestles with God's ultimate goodness and desire for what's best for humanity, and we see that through all these stories. Noah and the flood, the early creation stories, and then the deeper you go into Genesis, the deeper you get into these complex relationships. We won't get into every story here in this, but you have some really complex familial relationships. Abraham and the promise that he and Sarah will have these kids, and that doesn't come to fruition right away, and so they get creative in how to make it happen. And I mean, there's all kinds of complex family relationship stuff going on in there. You get to the story. We talked last night, Sacred Wit, about Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat. That is a beautiful story of family and family drama, and and God's faithfulness weaves throughout it. That the people try to seek God's favor, and then they try to wiggle their way away from God's favor and figure it out on their own, and then they keep being humbled and brought back to relying on God. I mean, that's kind of repeated over and over.
Right, and that cycle continues no matter how you kind of think about these stories. If we keep that lens as an understanding, like God's people really kind of do things to mess things up, and God continually steps in just enough to say, hey, this is what the purpose and intent of all of this is, and you keep missing the point.
Right.
It's kind of that, you smack your kid on the hand, go knock it off, like stop doing that. Eventually it kicks in, but sometimes it takes 10 or 15 or in this case hundreds of times in order to really get us back to that purpose.
Yeah.
And it's a lesson I think we're still learning today.
That's fair, yep. Right. Well, anything else you want to say, some of the stories in Genesis that would be worth highlighting?
Yeah, I think the one that often gets really lost and confused as people think about it is the Tower of Babel story.
Sure.
Babel, depends how you want to say it. I'm no expert in this conversation either. But it's one of those things where humanity uses their common ground, their common language, to build a tower to reach the heights of God.
Yeah.
So they want to be like God. And God does something kind of unique in there, that God confuses their language. If you read that kind of passage, if God creates with words and humanity uses words to put themselves on equal footing, that takes something of God saying, well, that isn't going to work. And I think it's one of those kind of interesting stories because it becomes the catalyst for how words are the thing that moves us to other gods. It moves us to other spaces, and it pulls away from this connection of God.
Yeah.
And if words are our tool to be like God, maybe we need to ask some questions about how we use words. And that will show up again as we kind of weave that needle. But I think it's one of those important stories to at least highlight. Yeah,
right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I touched on Abraham and Sarah, I guess. Abraham and Sarah, and that promise that Abraham has given, that he will be blessed to be a blessing, and it's this promise that then is ultimately fulfilled in different ways throughout the rest of the Bible.
Right, and it becomes important to even note the Abraham and Sarah story, that the promise, your descendants will be more numerous than the stars.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that can't happen if your people are wiped out.
Yeah.
Which we're going to discover as we move into Exodus, the story of Moses and fleeing Egypt. There's this element of, well, what really happens to God's people?
Right.
How does God fulfill that promise made with Abraham and Sarah, and how does that carry through as we think about that Exodus and things like that?
Yeah. I wonder. This is I didn't write in my notes, but I think what gets us to the book of Exodus out of Genesis is this Israel story, and Israel is a name that comes up all throughout the Bible, and is, I think, helpful to have a primer on. And so I probably should have written notes about it. So between the two of us, I think we can get there. So I mentioned Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph's father is Jacob, who is given the nickname or the name Israel because he wrestles with God, right? He has that time, there's that story in the Bible where he's traveling and some guy appears and he wrestles them through the night, and it turns out it's God or an angel of God, some kind of thing, and God takes a cheap shot, breaks his hip, and then says, you'll be called Israel, for you struggled with God. Right. And so then that becomes Jacob's name. He's called Israel, but then it'll also become his family's name, and then ultimately the people of Israel, and we all know the nation of Israel. And so this is all tied back to that story that comes in Genesis of the people of Israel. And a part of that story is, Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers, because they're jealous of his nice coat and really more of his dad's love, and so they end up all in Egypt, because ultimately there's a famine that brings the whole family to Egypt, and life is good in Egypt until that Pharaoh who loved Joseph dies, and all of a sudden all these Hebrew people who are there, these Israelites, end up as real good targets for slaves, because they're not Egyptian and they're not anymore in the favor of Pharaoh, and so they end up in slavery, and that's what gets us to the book of Exodus. Is there any points you would fill in or slots
the
in?
only kind of place I would kind of wrestle with too is the old Pharaoh dies, the new Pharaoh fears that they're going to rise up as people against him.
Yeah.
Because the Israelite people are so numerous that they could create an army of their own.
Yeah.
And essentially wipe out the Pharaoh.
Right.
So it's an act of fear that drives the Pharaoh to make those choices.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things. So think about that as we're talking about numbers of people.
Yeah.
Really playing into that next conversation. So as we think about the Exodus in this story, eventually that number will become so small that it's a manageable size for any army.
Sure.
And that'll become the division into the land of Israel rather than the people of Israel.
Sure.
So everything we're talking about before we get to all that point is really about a people, a nation of people, rather than a physical space, a land.
Right.
I think that's a good distinction.
Yeah, and that's a complexity that has followed Israel to current day, right? I mean, the dispute over Israel-Palestine is a dispute over land and a people. Is Israel a people or is it a land? And the answer is yep. And of course politically it's all kinds of complications, but that's not a new problem. Right. It traces back to here. So
right. Yeah, and I think that's a good way for us to think about, what does the Old Testament have to do with today?
Yeah.
There are some of these carryovers that really happen, and often I think there's that disconnect of, well, it's Old Testament, that's not the Bible we understand.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, these stories are really woven together, and they are interconnected even as we live today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, so that Jacob, ending up bringing his whole family and tribe to Egypt gets us to then ultimately the Egyptians making folks their slaves, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, and that's what leads us to the book of Exodus. And so, anything else to get us into Exodus, or away we go?
Yeah, I think it's away we go.
And obviously Genesis has many other stories that are deep and complicated and beautiful that we haven't touched on, some ugly that we haven't touched on. But there's just a lot there. But that I think we've hit those themes though. It's God being faithful and frustrated with the people's lack of faith, and the people trying to be faithful and always falling short. Right. I mean, in a nutshell.
Right, and there's a lot of humor and humanity that exists within those texts, and I think that's one thing that gets sort of washed away. Is I think we read them as stories of this thing that happened so long ago, instead of saying, there are people who are longing for children, who laugh at God's promise. Like Sarah does in the Abraham and Sarah story.
Yeah.
I think that humanity really kind of becomes important for us to acknowledge too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Exodus becomes a book that is largely focused. I mean, it's fair to say that Moses is the main character of Exodus, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
He's kind of the hero character, a flawed hero, nonetheless, but a hero. What do you say?
Well, this idea of being called by God to lead a people into freedom, and really the liberation of these Israelite people. I think that's one word that you'll see continually throughout Scripture, is what is God liberating from or for God's people.
Right.
And how does that really kind of play out as we think about that story forward?
Right. So if you've seen the Ten Commandments movie or the Prince of Egypt, some of these movies that are about this story of Exodus, you get some of the main points that Moses, is born into slavery, but the Egyptians are getting a little nervous about the, people of Israel, these Hebrew people getting to be too many of them again, and so they start killing babies. Real pleasant story of the Bible, right?
Especially male babies.
Yeah, and so to save her baby, Moses' mom puts him in the basket, floats him down the river. Story goes he ends up in Pharaoh's house and is raised as a child in the house of Pharaoh, and that has its perks. And so ultimately he starts discovering who he is, ends up seeing some slave driver Egyptian, beating a Hebrew, takes him and kills the guy, goes into hiding, meets his father-in-law Jethro, ends up marrying Jethro's daughter and making a life for himself. And then God appears in a burning bush, says, Moses, actually we have unfinished business in Egypt, let's go back, let my people go. And so Moses goes back. Well, first he says, I can't, I'm not a very good public speaker, I stutter and whatever. And God says, don't worry, we'll take care of that. And away he goes back into Egypt to lead the people out. But that doesn't go so smoothly either, does it?
No, I think there's just a lot of back and forth, being led to freedom, having food provided for you on a daily basis. Yeah. All your needs met, and we still grumble and complain that slavery in Egypt would have been better than wandering in the wilderness. Yeah. Right? So faithfulness, right? Right. God still provides. And the story bounces back and forth in all of those sort of moments.
Yeah, and even getting out of Egypt isn't as easy as maybe they would have thought. But the Bible tells these stories of plagues coming. Moses says, Pharaoh, let my people go, and Pharaoh says no, and so then these plagues come, these bad things that happen to, everyone, but especially the people of Egypt are afflicted. And the last one being, I think worth mentioning because it's where we get the idea of Passover, where the plague is promised that, the firstborn of each household will die unless you have put the blood of the sacrificed lamb over your door. Lamb? Is it a lamb? Yep. Or just a sheep, full-grown sheep? I can't remember. Anyway, it's a sheep.
One of those things.
And it over the doorpost. And so all of the Hebrew people, this people of Israel, do that, and they have their bags packed, ready to go, because that's what the vision has been, that they're going to go. This is going to be what pushes Pharaoh over the edge and lets them go. And it is. Pharaoh's son dies, and so the people pack their bags and away they go on their Exodus journey. Their Exodus, that's the name, because they exodus from Egypt. They leave. They exit.
Yeah, right. Exit stage right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's that great kind of sense of, we get these reminders of the Israelite slaves their children are killed. Ultimately becomes the gateway to freedom for, God ultimately moves against the Pharaoh's people. Yeah. And so there's these kind of like parallels within the story that are really interesting if you pay attention to. Yeah. And then we get to wandering. And, and again, it leads us to these Ten Commandments, the golden calf, like all of these great moments where, people are people and they continue to sort of, God is great, until God isn't, and something more convenient pops up.
Yeah.
And this sort of internal wrestling within God's people against God.
Right.
And so
this is where you picture Charlton Heston, right? Wandering through the wilderness and splitting the Red Sea so that they can cross, and Pharaoh's army does not get across, and so they get washed away, and that is not great for them.
Right.
And yet then, like you say, the people wander in the desert, and one of the things that happens is the giving of the Ten Commandments, which of course is pretty influential for the life of us still. Those 10 commandments play a pretty important role for our understanding of what are things that are good to do and things that are not good to do. But the story, Moses comes down with the first set of the 10 commandments, and the people, while he's been up there, have built a golden calf to worship, because this God they've been following that they can't see, they don't really know, so they build a golden calf. He throws them at him, and in the movie it's like a bomb, right? It's like a grenade, the tablets, and they blow up the golden calf. Really good stuff. And
cinematic splendor.
Yeah, and so then he goes up, he gets another set, and he comes down, and that time they're a little bit better. But yeah, I mean, anything else with the story of Exodus before we get to how it wraps up? Ultimately?
Yeah, I think the wrapping up is the next place I would want to land. It's really what comes out of that. So the reason they build the golden calf is they're impatient that Moses is taking too long.
Yeah.
That just takes forever, and God is up there.
Yeah.
We want to make God where we are.
Yeah.
And that plays into this sort of next kind of wrapping up of the Exodus story, which is really, they end up building this tent, this tabernacle, and the ark where the covenant or the Ten Commandments sits. Those all become spaces that move with God's people, that God moves from this sort of lofty thing to the space within them.
Yeah.
And so it turns the idea to worship rather than the tangible, seeable, conversational God that we discover early in Genesis and early Exodus.
Yeah.
And so God moves down within them as an act of worship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a part of that story then is that Moses doesn't get to enter the promised land, this land of flowing with milk and honey that has been promised to them after 40 years in the wilderness. He doesn't get to go in. That whole generation doesn't get to go in because of that unfaithfulness. But the next generation does, and and that tabernacle worship, which will ultimately become a temple that's built in Jerusalem. We're skipping ahead to the historical books, part 2, episode 2. But that'll come, but it begins with that tabernacle that has the Ten Commandments and that ark that is built as its core.
Right, and where when the cloud settles on the tent, the people stay in place, and when it lifts and moves, the people know to follow the cloud, to follow the presence of God. And I think that's really kind of interesting. You mentioned the jumping of Moses not entering. You've really kind of talked about the book of Numbers.
Yes, right.
Really, and so this might be a great place for us to drop that little nugget in there. So this is one of the challenges of Scripture, is that some books exist outside of, but within scriptural layers.
Yeah.
When God says, these people will go to the promised land, eventually these people grumble and complain. And so there's this problem that exists, and Moses ultimately has to take a census. The first one determines the nation's army size so they can be victorious in battles or protect the people. And the second census that exists in the book of Numbers is really all about, have those people that complained and grumbled and whined against me, have they all died off now that we can finally get to the promised land? And I think that's one of those elements that's kind of intriguing within Scripture. Yeah.
The book of Numbers, aptly named because it involves a lot of counting.
It's 2 censuses and a whole lot of family lineage and numbers. So I think that's important for us to kind of say at this point that really kind of layers within this story. There's not much else that I would add to that other than that's kind of the general gist of things as it moves into this ultimate entrance into the land that God has promised.
Yeah, and so I think that is probably a natural transition to, so we've talked a lot about Genesis and Exodus because they're the big mamas of the Pentateuch, right? I mean, they're the kind of core. Genesis especially, but then Exodus being also just core to all that'll come next. And the next ones, that Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they kind of blend together a little bit because they're the continuation of the law and the Moses story.
Yeah.
But I think it's okay to maybe admit that like we don't really necessarily treat all parts of the Bible equally as when we read Scripture.
Yeah. Right.
Is that fair? I mean, Moses talked about the Gospels being, the Bible being the manger that holds the Christ child, and there being some straw in there that isn't as important as the Christ child, himself, as a way of thinking about, okay, like if we're being honest, some like reading the whole list of names of families in the book of Numbers is probably not going to shape and direct how you live your life on a Thursday morning, right? And that's maybe okay to admit that. Whereas like the Ten Commandments, a pretty helpful guide, to be carrying forward. So anyway, I think that's going to be reflected in how we talk about these different books of the
Right,
Bible.
and that especially comes true of the book of Leviticus too.
Yeah.
It's 613 laws about sacrifice and right living and living in relationship with one another, living in relationship to God when we break those sort of human connections. And so a lot of it is great, but I don't know the last time we burned a ram on the altar just because, right?
Most of those practices have been left by the wayside.
Right, but I think it's what is important is lifting out the sense of it's how we live together. It's how we live in community, and we put God at the center of that relationship. And often that is a piece that gets so bogged down by living the black and white that we miss the grace and those things that come up as we think New Testament. And so they are important, but I don't want to sit and dwell in them. Because I think I'm wearing mixed cotton fibers in my shirt right now, and that might not be a good thing.
That is officially not allowed according to Scripture.
Right. And so thinking about like how does that all impact us today, and how do we think about those conversations moving forward?
Yeah. I think it's so funny that the air conditioner units that we turned off kicked on a while ago, and now we got a guy mowing outside. I apologize for this. I thought we were doing pretty well, and even the things that were within our control, I don't know why that turned on a while back, and then the fact that they're mowing outside. You just can't control everything.
Can't win them all.
No.
Right.
Well, so Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are there other elements of those books that'd be worth touching on here?
Yeah, I think Deuteronomy, one of the key things is it's Moses' farewell address. So I think this is the final letter knowing that your end is coming. So what would you want to say to the people of God who have been following you through the wilderness and kind of making life both good and bad? What would you want to tell them? And a lot of it is reiterating the Ten Commandments, the way that we live together. But also saying now the responsibility of teaching and instructing, that's going to fall on you as people. How do we grow together in this faith thing? And then just really saying, despite all of this, despite those times when we fall short and we fail, you get to chapter 10 towards the end is really about God, Moses saying, despite all those things, God still loves you, and God has promised this, and this is where we will go. And I think that's one of those kind of beautiful moments. And then just that reminder that in the end of it, Moses sees the promised land. He's able to look into it and say, okay, God did really fulfill that, but he never enters. He's still part of that group that grumbled and complained. So there's kind of this uniqueness in this story of how does that faithfulness get lived out as a whole rather than a partial story. So that's what I got.
No, I think it's great, and I think that's about as good a place as any to wrap it up for today with this promise of God's love, that it is ultimately, that's what the blessing of this section of Scripture that'll obviously carry throughout, is that it's the story of God loving God's people from the beginning of creation, when there were people, and for all the screw-ups along the way, and that carries true for us in our lives as well. So
absolutely.
That's good.
No, I think and the fun thing is to go back and dig a little deeper into the story and say, what is
Yeah.
this about? What is God trying to show us as we move forward?
Yeah.
And finding those sort of nuggets that exist within that to teach us things today.
Yeah.
I think that's where the fun of Scripture really plays out in my nerdiness, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. So, I'd invite everyone to join us on Sunday, where we'll get a little more of an introduction, which will be for you all that heard this pretty expert now. So you'll have it nailed down. But we'll also then think about okay, life is good, very good. In fact, it says in creation that humans are very good. But also life is messy, and that is a theme that has come through all these stories, whether it's the first homicide or the 10 Commandments, this excellent guide that we just don't follow all that well. So what does that mean? How do we find good news in the midst of a messy world? And so we'll be talking about those things on Sunday as well. And in the bulletin, which is available online now if you want to read ahead, you can find even a little more of a description. Jeremy's got some notes at what they kind of look like.
A few pages to kind of dig in.
Yeah, a few pages of extra notes if you want to get some extra background information. And so again, join us Sunday, and then we'll be back here next Thursday as well, looking at the next section of the Bible, which is an even bigger chunk of the Bible called the historical book. So getting some of the history of what comes next with God's people. So
Awesome.
Any other closing thoughts?
No, go in peace.
That's good. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you again soon.